Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Happy New Year. So we are just waiting for Yvette Cooper to take the stage to give us her statement on the grooming gangs. We had Keir Starmer do a press conference earlier telling us various things like his plans for NHS reform, but most importantly, everyone was looking to see what he had to say about the grooming gangs, because he's been very silent as over the past few days, as we've had people like Elon Musk and various figures pointing out the fact that Keir Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions between 2008 and 2013, asking questions about whether Keir Starmer did an adequate job of dealing with the grooming gangs as that Director of Public Prosecutions. A lot of questions to be answered there. And also really wanting to hear from him his defence as to whether or not there should be, as to why there should not be, in Labour's eyes, a full public inquiry into the grooming gangs scandal. And it's fair to say that he did more to ruin his reputation than to improve it in this speech, because he had this to say.
And when politicians, and I mean politicians, who sat in government for many years, are casual about honesty, decency, truth, and the rule of law, calling for inquiries because they want to jump on a bandwagon of the far right, then that affects politics, because a robust debate can only be based on the true facts.
Did you hear that? So Keir Starmer thinks that those of us calling now for a public inquiry into the grooming gangs, that we are jumping on a far-right bandwagon. And this absolutely infuriated me. This press conference was an opportunity for Keir Starmer to stand there and tell us proper reasons why he does not think we need a public inquiry, to clear the bad air about his record as Director of Public Prosecutions. This was an opportunity for him to do some good for his reputation. But by smearing the people up and down across this country of all sorts of political opinions, left and right, who are quite rightly disgusted by the mass rape of young girls in this country, as far right, I think was absolutely vile. And the particular reason why this infuriates me is because this label far right is the reason why this scandal has been swept under the carpet time and time again. Every time it crops up, people say, oh, it's just some, far-right conspiracy theory. And consequently, people in the centre and people on the left are scared to do the right thing, to uncover what actually happened, because they're worried about being called far-right and being called racist. So, we've had the Reform Party coming out strong, and we'll have a look at Nigel's message in a moment whilst we're still waiting for Yvette Cooper, who is very late. It's 5:38 and we still cannot see her. We've had, the Reform Party coming out strong. Rupert Lowe putting out lots of tweets, asking lots of questions of the Home Office. We've had Kemi Badenoch in the Conservative Party, of course, also calling for a public inquiry. But it's just not good enough for only parties on the right of politics to be calling for proper transparency on this, to be calling for an inquiry, to be calling for justice for the victims. Because if only the people on the right speak up about this, it will be the same story again. This will be dismissed as some kind of, far-right conspiracy issue, and nothing proper will be done about this. So I would say to our viewers and listeners, if you have an MP, if your local MP is a Labour MP, write to them. Tell them, if you're a backbench MP, please stand up, call on your leader and ask him for a public inquiry. Be vocal about it. Don't be scared to talk about it. Because at this point in time, we need people on the left, much more than we need people on the right. I want people on the right, and I want Nigel Farage and everyone else, I want them to be shouting about it as well. But we need everyone across the whole spectrum, people on the left, to be shouting about this as well, so that this cannot, once again, be dismissed as some sort of far-right conspiracy theory, because else there will be no justice for the victims. We saw earlier Charlie Peters reporting for GB News, who has been speaking to victims today, and they have responded to what Keir Starmer had today. And I think they were really, really frustrated to hear that the people online who are now finally standing up for them and asking for justice for them have been dismissed by our Prime Minister as far right. These girls and women who were abused, they are so thankful and so grateful for the fact that people are finally talking about them and people are finally asking for answers. People are finally asking for a proper inquiry. People are finally asking for proper justice for them. I don't think that those girls would have been happy today to hear Keir Starmer dismiss those that want justice for them as people jumping on a far-right bandwagon. It genuinely baffles me that the Prime Minister used those words. Well, he did it at the Southport with the Southport riots. You thought he would have learnt his lesson there. Okay? I think, in this case it is far, far worse because, surely there is no shadow. The Southport riots had something to do with concerns about immigration. And although I don't agree with the argument, I understand that there is some argument to be made by those on the left that people who are against immigration are on the right. He might think that they have some kind of problem with racism if they don't want people coming to this country. I don't agree with that argument, but I see there is some sort of argument to be made. However, when it comes to grooming gangs, the mass rape of young children, I'm sorry, but that's not a right-wing issue. Everybody, left to right, doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum, should be absolutely appalled and disgusted by rape. I'm sorry, I just do not understand how someone who's meant to be a professional man, our Prime Minister, can speak in such a way. I just think it's absolutely disgusting. So let me know in the comments your thoughts on what Keir Starmer said. Still seem to be waiting for Yvette Cooper to speak. There's various chit-chat going. We've got the Parliament Live TV up and running, but we're still waiting for her to speak. So whilst we wait for her, let's just have a look at what Nigel had to say in response to the Prime Minister's comments.
Well, so much talk over the last few days about grooming gangs, or should I say rape gangs. And Keir Starmer today saying that anyone who's calling for a full public inquiry is jumping on the bandwagon of the far right. Wrong, Prime Minister. The vast majority of people in this country are absolutely mortified by what has gone on. But even worse, the cover-up we've had from the police, social services, and both Conservative and Labour governments. The inquiries that have happened so far have been nothing more than a whitewash. There needs to be a full public inquiry. Let us find out the truth of the scale of this. I'm told that in up to 50 British towns, these gang rapes were going on. I believe the public need the truth. We must have an inquiry.
So there we go. That is what Nigel Farage had to say there. As I said previously, I'm very, very glad to see Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, Rupert Lowe, also are doing a fantastic job to speak up against this and to make strong demands for a public inquiry. But we need people on the left as well to stand up, else this will once again be dismissed as a far-right issue, and in a week we'll have all forgotten about this and nothing will change. So I don't have a Labour MP in my area. I've got a Lib Dem, but I will write to her as well. But if you've got a Labour MP in your area, please write to them and ask them to speak to their leader, Keir Starmer, and ask him to change his mind about this and tell him that you, as a constituent, you want there to be a public inquiry. Okay? Looks like there's a bunch of shuffling, people moving around in the House of Commons, so hopefully Yvette Cooper is going to speak shortly. Let's just have a look at a couple of comments. Him and his far-right lovies are so out of touch with basic humanity, it is nothing but shocking. Were the thousands of young white girls far-right more of Starmer's bullshit? If you look at Rotherham, one of the people who has been, very outspoken, was running risky business in the Rotherham Council to help survivors. She was in the Labour Party. She was a Labour councillor. She then asked for help after... Oh, it looks like we've got Yvette Cooper, so let's move on.
And horrific of crimes involving rape, violence, coercive control, intimidation, manipulation.
Please let me know if you can hear this okay in the comments.
The information from the crime survey should be chilling to all of us. It estimates that 500,000 children every year experience some form of child sexual abuse, violence and sexual violation in the home, repeated rapes or exploitation by grooming or paedophile gangs, threats and intimidation involving intimate images online, abuse within institutions that should have protected and cared for young people, cruel and sadistic crimes against those who are most vulnerable. All of us have a responsibility to protect our children. Perpetrators must be punished and pursued. Victims and survivors must be protected and supported. But these crimes have not been taken seriously for too long, and far too many children have been failed. That is why this government is determined to act, strengthening the law, taking forward recommendations from independent inquiries, supporting stronger police action and protection for victims. There is no excuse for anyone not to take these crimes seriously. Brave survivors speaking out have shone a light on terrible crimes and the failure of institutions to act, be it in care homes in Rochdale, Asian grooming gangs in Rotherham or Telford, abuse that was covered up within faith institutions, including the Church of England and Catholic Church, or within family homes. And that report, alongside other appalling crimes coming to light, is why, in opposition, our party called for a national independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and supported that work when it was launched by the previous government. Over 7 years, that inquiry, expertly led by Professor Alexis Jay, engaged with more than 7,000 victims and survivors, processed 2 million pages of evidence, and published 61 reports and publications. Its findings should be truly disturbing for everyone, describing the pain and suffering caused to victims and survivors, the deviousness and cruelty of perpetrators. Nor is there any excuse for anyone not to recognise and act on the deep harm and damage from organised gang exploitation, abuse, sexual assaults and rape. 10 years ago, 2 reports by Alexis Jay and Louise Casey in Rotherham found that 1,400 children were sexually exploited, raped by multiple perpetrators, trafficked across other towns, abducted, beaten, threatened with guns, even children who had been doused in petrol, girls as young as 11 who were raped. And their reports identified then, a decade ago, a failure to confront Pakistani heritage gangs and, quote, a widespread perception that they should downplay the ethnic dimensions for fear of being seen to be racist. When those reports came out, those failings in Rotherham were condemned across the board by both government and opposition in this House. As I said at the time, it is never an excuse to use race and ethnicity or community relations as an excuse not to investigate and punish sex offenders. Hear, hear. And the then Home Secretary made clear cultural concerns and fear of being seen as racist must never stand in the way of child protection. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse also ran a specific investigation strand into child sexual exploitation by organised networks. It ran for 2 years and produced a separate report in February 2022, which concluded that police forces and local councils were still failing to tackle this serious crime and set out further recommendations for change. But Madam Deputy Speaker, despite these different inquiries drawing up multiple recommendations, far too little has actually been done. None of the 20 recommendations from the independent inquiry into child abuse have been implemented. As the Act on Independent Child Abuse Campaign Group from the Survivors Trust has said this week, victims of child sexual abuse cannot afford further delays in meaningful action. And they said it is now imperative to keep the focus on radical reform. Two different Conservative Home Secretaries said after the report was published it was a watershed, should be the beginning of a new chapter for change, but that has not happened. We now need new impetus and action. Since coming into office, the Safeguarding Minister has met with Professor Alexis Jay and survivors and convened the first dedicated cross-government group to drive forward change. And to ensure that victims' voices remain at the very heart of this process, I can tell the House that we will set up a new Victims and Survivors panel to work on an ongoing basis with the interministerial group to guide them on the design, delivery and implementation of new proposals and plans, not just on the ICSA inquiry, but on wider work around child sexual exploitation and abuse. And we will set out more details and timescales based on that work. But before that, I can announce action on 3 key recommendations. First, I can confirm we will make it mandatory to report abuse, and we will put the measures in the Crime and Policing Bill that will be put before Parliament this spring, making it an offence with professional and criminal sanctions to fail to report or cover up child sexual abuse. The protection of institutions must never be put before the protection of children. Madam Deputy Speaker, this measure is something I first called for in response to the reports and failings in Rotherham 10 years ago. It's something that the Prime Minister first called for 12 years ago, based on his experience as Director for Public Prosecutions. And the case was clear then, but we've lost a decade and we need to get on with it now. Second, we'll also legislate to make grooming an aggravating factor in the sentencing of child sexual offences, because the punishment must fit the terrible crime. And third, we will overhaul the information and evidence that is gathered on child sexual abuse and exploitation and embed it in a clear new performance framework for policing, so these crimes are taken far more seriously. The independent inquiry recommended as one of its first recommendations a single core data set on child abuse and protection, but that's never been done. We'll introduce a single child identifier in the Children Wellbeing Bill and a much stronger police performance framework, including new standards on public protection, child abuse and exploitation. We're accelerating the work of the Child Sexual Exploitation Police Task Force, set up rightly under the previous government, and there has been a 25% increase in arrests between July and September of this year. That sits alongside the Tackling Organised Exploitation programme, which is using advanced data analytics to uncover the complex networks. The data on ethnicity is now being published, but we will work further with them to improve the accuracy and robustness of the data and analysis. And we will continue to support further investigations that are needed, including police investigations and local independent inquiries and reviews which can expose failings and wrongdoing in local areas and institutions, as we've seen in Telford, in Rotherham and Greater Manchester. We support the ongoing work commissioned by Mayor Andy Burnham into historic abuse in Oldham, which has led to new police investigations, arrests and convictions, and to build on those findings. The leader of Oldham Council has confirmed this week work to set up a further local independent inquiry is already underway, including liaison with Oldham survivors. We welcome and support this work, which will put victims' voices at its heart. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Telford inquiry was particularly effective because it involved victims in shaping the inquiry, and they were involved at every stage. So Tom Crowther, who led that inquiry, has now agreed to work with the government and with other local councils where stronger engagement with victims or survivors is needed, or where more formal inquiries are required to tackle persistent problems. But we should also be clear. Wherever there have been failings or that perpetrators of terrible crimes have not been brought to justice, the most important inquiries and investigations should be police investigations to track those perpetrators down, to bring them before the courts and to get the victims the protection that they deserve. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have to face the serious challenge that the fastest growing area of grooming and child abuse is now online. So we will also take much stronger action to crack down on rapidly evolving forms of child sexual exploitation and abuse and grooming online, including to tackle the exponential rise in AI-facilitated child sexual abuse material. And we will set out a significant package of measures to strengthen the law in this area in the coming weeks. For many years, there has been broad cross-party consensus, not only on the importance of this work, but that the interests of victims and survivors must come first. There will be different views about the details of the policies that are needed, but every one of us across this House has supported action to protect our children, and that is all our responsibility to keep them safe for the future. So I hope that members across the House will work with ministers and with the victims and survivors panel that we are setting up to change protection for the better and to make sure it is perpetrators who pay the price. I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Secretary of State, Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. The whole country
Let's just see if
is
he's got
shocked
anything interesting to
by
say before
the
we move
rape
on.
gang scandal. Over years or decades, thousands and maybe tens of thousands of vulnerable young girls were systematically raped by organised gangs of men, predominantly of Pakistani heritage. Instead of those victims being protected and the perpetrators prosecuted, those girls were systematically failed. Many cases were covered up because of absurd concerns about so-called community relations. Police often did not investigate. Local councils covered things up. The Crown Prosecution Service frequently failed victims. And those raising concerns were frequently accused of racism. Never again can people be silenced in that way. And I pay tribute to people who have raised these cases over the years, starting, I think, with former Labour MP Anne Cryer, nearly 2 decades ago, who first raised these problems and bravely persevered, despite accusations of racism and worse, including from her very own colleagues. And let me just say, in that vein, a word on the Prime Minister's comments this morning. It is not far right to stand up for victims of mass rape.
Someone had to say that. Somebody had to say that.
And smearing people.
Order!
That caused quite a roar.
People want to hear the statement. Chris Philp.
Smearing people who raise those issues is exactly how this ended up getting covered up in the first place. Now, I will, of course, repeat now what I said yesterday, that intimidation and threats towards elected members of Parliament and ministers, including the member for Birmingham Yardley, are completely wrong. Now, as the Home Secretary said, action is important, and the last government took extensive action, starting with the original Jay report commissioned in 2014 by previous Home Secretary, now Baroness May. A year later, she commissioned the independent investigation into child sexual abuse, and it was Sajid Javid who commissioned data collection in about 2018. Now, in relation to the response to the ICSA report published in 2022, it is not true to say the last government took no action. The last government established the Grooming Gangs Task Force, whose work led to 550 arrests of perpetrators in the first year and safeguarded 4,500 victims. So my first question to the Home Secretary is this: can she confirm to the House, I'm sure she can, but can she confirm to the House that the Grooming Gangs Task Force work will continue and I hope even be stepped up? Secondly, as part of the work of the Grooming Gangs Task Force, and again implementing one of the recommendations of the ICSA report, in April 2023, the last government mandated data collection in relation to ethnicity that the Home Secretary also referred to. Will she confirm, now it's been going for about a year and a half, or over a year and a half, will the Home Secretary now confirm that data on the ethnicity of perpetrators will be published? Now, as the Home Secretary, of course, has acknowledged, one of ICSA's main recommendations was mandatory reporting to the police by people in positions of responsibility. Now, the last government was in the process of implementing that recommendation via a measure in the Criminal Justice Bill, which fell with the early election. Now, I'm glad to hear the Home Secretary has just announced that she will continue with the last government's proposals in her forthcoming bill, and she can be assured that the opposition will support the government in the continuation of that measure. Now, finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Home Secretary did not address the need for a full national public inquiry on this scandal. Now, while the last government did initiate the ICSA inquiry under Professor Jay. That was mainly directed at other child sexual abuse and exploitation issues, and it only covered 6 of the towns involved in the gang rape scandal. So it didn't cover everything. We do need to get to the truth. We now have evidence, new evidence of further that is of interest to the public, including what Simon Danchuk, the former Labour MP for Rochdale, said about the way he was pressured into staying silent. We have evidence about local authorities covering this up. We have the 3rd report last year on Operation Span, commissioned by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, exposing failings by the Crown Prosecution Service, which are extremely serious. This all needs to be looked into, so will the Home Secretary commission that national statutory public inquiry which can compel witnesses to attend, that can requisition evidence, and where it can take evidence under oath? And if the government will not order that statutory national public inquiry, we will table an amendment to the Children Wellbeing Bill later this week to put the matter to a vote. And I hope members across the House will vote for that full statutory public inquiry so we can get to the truth.
Home Secretary.
Right, let's see if Yvette Cooper's got anything interesting to say to this, and then we'll have a talk about all your comments.
This is an issue in which, when I was the Shadow Home Secretary, when I was the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, I worked with government ministers on, and in which there has been cross-party consensus on the need to tackle these very serious and vile crimes. This is the most appalling crimes against children. The brutal rape, repeated multiple rapes of children, particularly young girls, but also young boys, in the most appalling.
Well, if it's so brutal, why don't you want a public inquiry?
For those children, often it be people who should have protected them, who should have looked after them, and where institutions failed to keep them safe. That's why the independent inquiry was so important. It's why I called for it. It's where many other people in this House, across this House, called for it, and it's why we supported it when the previous government set it up. But the truth is there just has not been enough action to tackle these vile crimes. There hasn't been enough change to policies, to the way in which services operate at local level. And that is a deep failing that those changes have not taken place. He used the example of the duty to report. This is incredibly important because it is about preventing any chance of people turning a blind eye, of professionals turning a blind eye to abuse, of people covering up child abuse and exploitation in the most appalling way. It's about making it a criminal offence. And yet we called for it 10 years ago. He had a decade in order to introduce that, a decade that we have now lost without having those powers and those measures in place. He rightly talks about the task force. I mentioned that in my response, and we've supported. It's not just continuing with that task force, but actually accelerating its work. So it has increased. The last quarter of arrests have increased on the previous quarter, a significant increase in arrests, because the thing I want to see most of all is I want to see perpetrators behind bars. I want to see perpetrators pay the price for the vile crimes against children. And in order to do that, we have to improve policing performance and the coordinated work between police and local councils across the country in order to do this. So yes, we will accelerate the work of the task force. But he refers to the ethnicity data. It's already been published. It was published in November. The latest report was published in November as a result of the work of the task force. I would just say to him, though, I don't think that the data that they have gathered actually is adequate. I don't think it goes far enough. I think there's a real problem with the way in which we collect data, and police forces collect data. It's very haphazard. There isn't a proper
Everyone is commenting on how Jess Phillips looks.
A proper performance framework for policing. Because again, to be honest, I think his government withdrew too far from policing and having the kind of standards we need to have in place. I hope we can work together on having a stronger performance framework, having a clearer framework of data, including dealing with these issues around ethnicity. And the issue back in 2015, we had the consensus on the need to make sure that race and ethnicity are never used as an excuse not to tackle crime, that somehow...
Right, I think that is enough of it now, okay? I think we know that she is just going to babble on and repeat the same old crap over and over again. So, let's just talk about that and have a look at some of your comments. So Yvette Cooper there, not announcing a public inquiry. I had a small amount of hope that after the whole backlash with Starmer making that comment about the far right this morning, that maybe they'd decide, what, actually, we're in big shit here. Let's just say we're going to do a public inquiry. But no, but she has announced some action that's going to be taken. So, for example, announcing there that it will be a criminal offence to be someone who is covering this up, someone in the police, for example, because one of the huge issues with this is the fact that nobody has been held account, people in the police, people in the councils, etc., for covering this up. You've had, the odd few resignations here and there. We had some people deselected for their council seats after GB News revealed a bunch of information about them. But on the whole, barely anybody has really been held to account for this. So we got a few little nuggets there of some good news for them to try and make it sound. And, her talking there about the victims being heavily involved in conversations about the steps that they take going forward to, implement the recommendations of the reports that have already been done. So, I think it's good for the victims to be involved so they don't do pointless crap that's not actually solving the issue. But, at the end of the day, she talks there about getting the victims involved and helping the victims. Why don't you actually listen to what the victims are saying? If the victims felt like they did not need a public inquiry and they just needed action, because she's just saying there, we need action, these victims don't want to wait for another inquiry, well, actually listen to what they have to say. Because, we've got at the moment Charlie Peters from GB News is going around the country this week talking to victims, talking to survivors in various different towns and cities, and the impression we get from him is they all seem to be saying, we want a public inquiry, this is what we need, because the ICSA report was a sham. It barely covered grooming gangs at all. It covered other forms of child sexual exploitation. The small part of it that was focused on grooming gangs, they looked at, I think, 6 towns which actually had no previous sort of credible reports of grooming gangs. They didn't look at any of the towns that actually had a serious problem with it, like, Rochdale, Rotherham, Telford. It almost seemed like they were trying to avoid the issue, whether that was just incompetence or intentional. We will never know for sure. But, she is talking here about listening to victims, but if she was listening to victims, she would be going for a public inquiry. So she's tried to make it sound there, we think this is a very, very serious issue and we are taking affirmative action. We're going to continue the work of the Grooming Gangs Task Force. We're going to make it a criminal offence to be somebody who covers up child sexual exploitation and so on. So a little bit of fluff around the edges, but at the end of the day, no public inquiry, and not addressing the fact that Keir Starmer dismissed all of us asking for a public inquiry as far right earlier today. I thought that was absolutely vile and absolutely does not help at all this issue. It doesn't help this issue to be solved, because it's the same thing that happens every single time, as I said at the beginning of this video. Every single time this becomes a big issue, it ends up disappearing again because it gets dismissed as a far right issue. And people on the left and in the centre are scared to do anything about the issue because they think that they'll be called far right as well if they do something about this. We need people on the left all speaking up about this so we get to a position where this is considered a non-partisan issue. Not a left or a right-wing issue, non-partisan. Okay, let's take a look at a few of your comments. You probably saw I was flashing some of them up on the screen as we were going, but let's just have a little look at some of your comments. So Carol had said she will avoid the word Muslim grooming gang, and we had a bunch of you commenting on the way through, noticing, she's not really mentioning the ethnicity, she's not mentioning these are British, Pakistani Muslims, she's talking there about, people shouldn't be, covering this up to avoid being called racist and whatnot. But you know what? She didn't point out the elephant in the room, that we're talking here about British Pakistani Muslim gang. She probably was scared to say those words herself because she's scared of being called a racist and an Islamophobe. I mean, it's double standards. These people, they need to, grow a pair. I know she's a woman, but you need to grow a pair and just have some conviction and not be scared. And, Mark very much echoed that sentiment, saying she doesn't care. None of them do. RD says, we're gathering momentum. Let's get justice for the victims of state-sponsored rape. I think we've really, really got to capitalise on the momentum that we have got behind this issue now since Elon Musk, started tweeting about this. We've got a huge focus on the issue. Okay, the momentum will not last forever. All of you who've got a Twitter account, who've got a voice, you need to keep talking about this and keep demanding a public inquiry whilst there is momentum on this issue. We've got to take advantage of this whilst it lasts and make as much progress as we can. Because if we let the momentum die off, next week, nothing will have changed. There'll be no public inquiry, no, aside from those small few changes that Yvette Cooper announced there, nothing will change. And, this is also, it's not an issue of the past. This is still going on. There are still girls being raped, being groomed, and I don't want to live in a country where that happens. Okay, everyone commenting on Jess Phillips, she looked, I think it's fair to say, she looked rough. She must be very, very stressed at the moment. I don't say that out of sympathy, by the way, because she is the one who decided to write that letter and say, sorry, not going to help you. Let's see what else. Lucy said she won't call Starmer to account, and that absolutely was the case. She did not call out Keir Starmer as wrong for calling us a bunch of people jumping on a far right bandwagon. Let's see. Ian says deport all foreign criminals. So one of the things that we really want to see coming out of this current momentum and focus on this issue that we got is not just an independent inquiry, but we want to see that, those people who are convicted and maybe have been to prison, they need to be deported out of this country. Okay, one example of many is the Rochdale grooming gang leaders, two of them, 10 years after being in prison, still in the country. One of them in Rochdale, still in the same community. The victims have to see him on a regular basis. He lives in a house that little kids walk by all the time on the way to school, by the way. He only had to go to prison, this guy, for 2.5 years. 2.5 years for running a grooming gang that abused up to 47 young girls as young as 12. 2.5 years. So that's about as long as you get in prison for a Facebook post these days. Okay, so prison sentence way too short, and that is the case for many of them. Many of them, they only go to prison for a couple of years for doing the most, horrendous thing imaginable. And then they all get to stay in this country. You may see a renewed focus on leaving the ECHR, because one of the reasons why it's been so hard to get rid of these people is because they appeal on ECHR grounds, right to a family life and whatnot. If you have a wife and you have kids, it's pretty hard to kick them out the country. And you know what's even more disgusting is some of these guys who have made girls pregnant by raping them, they then say, oh, you can't deport me from the country because I have a family. Yeah, a child, which is a product of your rape. It's just so infuriating. So we need deportations. Wasn't that much talk of that from Yvette Cooper in that speech, which was quite disappointing. She really should have said something about deportation. Big up here, really just explaining what the big issue with just telling councils to do your own inquiry, as the Home Office and Jess Phillips are currently doing. Councils investigating themselves only leads to one guaranteed conclusion. You've had yes, she points out that we have had some good inquiries in places like Telford, but there have been issues with not only having not having enough resources for local inquiries, but also corruption within the councils. When they try to do investigations, somebody in the council who doesn't want their name smeared, who doesn't want their career ended, does whatever they can to stop the inquiry coming, the results coming out, or, coming out in full, telling the full scale and the full truth of it all, because they don't want to smear their own reputation. That is a significant issue. Okay, and also, when it's just done on a localised level, you don't really understand how this issue affects the whole country, the connections between different towns and cities. I feel you've got to look at this on a national picture, and that's not just me saying that, that's what the victims are saying. If she wants to listen to the victims, I think she'll hear those victims saying, we want a public inquiry. I am yet to see a victim typing on X or wherever saying, I don't want a public inquiry, I just want you to crack on with implementing the recommendations of the ICSA report. I haven't seen one. So I don't know where she gets this idea from, that that is the best thing to do for victims, because she really did make that all about the victims rather than her saying, look, we just haven't got the money, guys. She was like, the victims do not want to wait any longer. What victims are saying that? And also, it doesn't have to be one or the other. You can be implementing the results of one thing and still going ahead with the grooming gangs task force, making more arrests whilst doing an inquiry at the same time. It doesn't have to be one thing for 5 years and then the other. So anyway, thank you very much all for watching. We will of course be keeping you updated with any more announcements from Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, Jess Phillips, or whoever else on this. Let's hope that we get an announcement at some point where they give in and say that they'll have a public inquiry, but I'll believe it when I see it. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. See you all soon.
Still watching? Well, I've got a quick ask for you. Recent UK, we're fighting the woke brigade and inspiring young Brits, but we need your help to go bigger. We're hosting a fundraiser and would love you to sign up and share the link on the big day. It's easy, it makes a massive impact, and there are prizes for top fundraisers. Click the Google form in the description to join us. Cheers very much. Let's keep going together.